Hi everybody, Steve Matthews here. Thanks for joining me for episode 10 of our walk through Dr. John Robbins' book, Ecclesiastical Megalomania, the Economic and Political Thought of the Roman Catholic Church. Now, today we're going to be taking a look at chapter 5 of this book, and it's a pretty short chapter, but I think it's a pretty interesting one too. And the title of this chapter, it's Feudalism and Corporativism. And what it is, it's a look at the thought of a very prominent Italian philosopher and statesman by the name of Amintore Fanfani. And Fanfani was a pretty interesting guy. He was a very prominent fellow. And he had a take on Roman Catholicism that basically said that Roman Catholicism, the Roman Catholic philosophy and theology is actually hostile to capitalism. And of course, Fanfani was exactly right about that. Although, with that said, there are some Roman Catholic scholars and writers that today are trying to argue that Roman Catholicism promotes capitalism, which is incorrect. Fanfani had the right idea, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. So what I'd like to do to start us here today is read through the first couple paragraphs of chapter 5, and then we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail. So I'm just going to quote here from Dr. John Robbins' book. Quote, "One of the most influential laymen responsible for articulating and implementing Roman economic thought was the Italian philosopher and politician Amintore Fanfani. Fanfani was a leader of the Christian Democratic Party in Italy in the middle of the 20th century. He was elected to the Constituent Assembly in 1946 and to Parliament in 1948. He served as Minister of Labor in 1947, Minister of Agriculture in 1951, Minister of the Interior in 1954, was Premier in 1954, and again from 1958 to 1963. He was Minister of Foreign Affairs from 1963 to 1968, when he was elected President of the Italian Senate. In 1934, Fanfani published Catholicism, Protestantism, and Capitalism, which was immediately translated into English and published in London in 1935 by the Roman Catholic publishing house Sheed and Ward. The theme of the book, based on the Roman Church-state social doctrine, was that, interior quote, the essence of capitalism can only meet with the most decided repugnance on the part of Catholicism, end interior quote. Elaborating on the official Roman Church-state denunciations of capitalism, its praise for feudalism and corporativism, and its calls for reestablishing a corporativist social order, Fanfani's book remains one of the best summaries of Roman economic thought yet written. Unlike Michael Novak's and Robert Sirico's recent attempts to place a capitalist spin on Roman Catholic social thought, Fanfani's is a fairly accurate statement of Roman economic thought. Fanfani's book is a counterpart to Weber's, for he provided another aspect of the argument, an aspect that Weber had not developed. Catholicism is inimical to capitalism, end quote. Okay, so there's a lot there to unpack. As you can see from that, from the brief biography of Fanfani that John Robbins provided there, he was a very prominent fellow. In fact, I think Fanfani, I believe he was also Secretary General of the UN, I think maybe in 1969. So again, this is somebody who was a very prominent individual, both politically and as a scholar as well. And in fact, the book that John Robbins referred to, Catholicism, Protestantism, and Capitalism, here's a copy. This is my copy of it. This was originally published. You can see it's Amintore Fanfani, and there's the title right here. Now, this particular book, this particular edition that I have is published in 2003. The original was published in, as was said there by John Robbins, it was published in 1934. The edition that John Robbins used was published in 1984. Ecclesiastical Megalomania was done in 1999. That's when it was published. So even my edition of Fanfani's book wasn't even around at the time. It wasn't published till a few years later. But it's very interesting what Fanfani says, and also what those who support him say. In fact, I thought I'd read a little bit of this to you. This is from the preface of my edition. My edition was put out by an organization called IHS Press in Norfolk, Virginia, and it appears to be a Roman Catholic publishing house. And let me read a little bit to you. This is from the preface of Fanfani's book. So this is not, Fanfani is not the author. In fact, the authors are the directors of IHS Press. So These are the directors of the publisher of this particular edition, and they very much also side with Amintore Fanfani in saying that capitalism and Roman Catholicism have nothing to do with one another. Let me just read here this, as I said, I'm going to quote a few paragraphs. Quote, Catholicism, Protestantism, and Capitalism was last published in 1984, at which time Notre Dame University Press issued its edition with 2 introductions, one which accepted the book's basic premise and another which trashed it. Thus, part of the reason for making Fanfani's classic work available again is to set the record straight and to put to rest the arguments advanced against it by libertarian economists. Now, they have economists as in quote marks, like they're not really economists. By libertarian economists and warmongering neoconservatives who suggest that the intellectual roots of capitalism are compatible with, and even a natural outgrowth of, the tradition of thought and culture bequeathed to us by the Catholic Church. Fanfani's contention is just the opposite, that there is an unbridgeable gulf between the Catholic and the capitalistic conception of life. Now, notice here, these editors, the directors here of IHS Press and Fanfani himself, they both believe that capitalism was actually hostile to the intellectual roots or the intellectual and philosophical tradition of the Roman Catholic Church. John Robbins says the same thing. So even though Fanfani, the directors of IHS Press, these Roman Catholics, and John Robbins, who was a Presbyterian, Bible-believing Protestant, even though they're very different, they do agree on that particular point. I think that's very interesting. Sometimes there's this notion, and we can all fall into this, or I think a lot of us can, I know I certainly have at times, of finding maybe somebody that we have disagreements with. And Fanfani would certainly be somebody I'd have a lot of disagreements with. I'd find somebody like Fanfani, I'd say, well, he couldn't possibly be right about anything. Well, that's not true. I mean, it's very possible for somebody to be very erroneous in his thinking, as Fanfani is. Fanfani attacks capitalism. The directors of IHS Press attack capitalism. So they're definitely wrong about that. And as Christians, we would disagree with them. But they are correct in this one thing, and that is Fanfani realized that Roman Catholicism and capitalism don't mix. Unlike some of the other people, you may recall that in that piece, that portion that from John Robbins that I read, he mentioned 2 individuals. He mentioned Michael Novak and Robert Sirico. Now, Michael Novak, I believe, is deceased. Robert Sirico, he may still be alive. Sirico was or is a Roman Catholic priest. Novak was not. I believe he was a Catholic layman. But both Novak and Sirico had this idea that capitalism was consistent with Roman Catholicism, and indeed even grew out of it. And you'll find a lot of Roman Catholics that make that argument today. There's a website out there, LouRockwell.com, for example, that is run by Lou Rockwell, who is a Roman Catholic. And he also features a number of writers who are either Roman Catholic themselves or at least sympathetic to Roman Catholicism. I'm thinking of people like, say, Thomas DiLorenzo, Tom Woods, Murray Rothbard. Now, Murray Rothbard was not a Catholic. He was an atheist. He was of Jewish descent, but he was a Thomist, interestingly enough, and he had a lot of good things to say about Romanism, and he was actually pretty hostile, openly hostile to the Protestant Reformation and to Protestantism, which is kind of unusual because, of course, Murray Rothbard was somebody who promoted capitalism, but yet he failed to understand that it's biblical Christianity that provides the necessary ideas for a free society, free politically and free economically, to flourish. But yes, Fanfani and also the directors of IHS Press are correct. Capitalism is inimical to Roman Catholic theology and philosophy. No question about it. Let's see. In fact, there's another quote that was in here. Let's see. Oh, yeah, they quote, this is also from the preface, they're quoting Fanfani. And Fanfani writes this: if European history knew a pre-capitalistic age, it is in this age that we must seek for a trend in public life and private activity in harmony with social principles of Catholicism. When Catholic ethics have been a prevailing influence of public life, The result has been for various institutions and laws to coordinate the activity of private individuals in a non-capitalistic order, or in non-capitalistic orders, excuse me. So the directors of IHS Press were there quoting Amintore Fanfani directly from his book. And if you read farther in that particular section, I'm not going to read the whole quote, but when Fanfani's talking about ages, if European history knew a pre-capitalist age, when he's talking about this pre-capitalist age, he's talking about the medieval period. Okay, and this is one of the things that you find from a lot of these Roman Catholics, is they think the medieval period was awesome, and everything was great until that mean, nasty, dirty person, Martin Luther, came along and kind of threw a monkey wrench in all their fun. Well, I think one of the ways, I mean, in this, maybe this isn't, I think this is a pretty easy thing. Maybe you call it a intellectual experiment, a mental test. Ask yourself this: if the Middle Ages were so wonderfully capitalistic and so filled with all these libertarian ideas, how come there was so little freedom, so much human misery, and so little in the way of technological and economic development? I mean, there just wasn't much that took place there. I mean, that right there ought to tell you what the capitalism was, something that was absent from medieval society. I guess you would call him, well, I don't know if he was I guess he really wasn't a Renaissance scholar. I think he was writing in the 1500s. Thomas Hobbes, he was a well-known English philosopher. He described life as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. That's a fairly famous quote from his book, Leviathan. But I mean, that's what life was. It wasn't like what you and I have today. I mean, we've grown up in this society in which capitalism has been around now for hundreds of years, and we're the beneficiaries of that. But that wasn't the case in the Middle Ages. It was a very poor society. It was a very unfree society. I think I've read the average life expectancy at the time for a peasant anyway, I mean, maybe it was 30 years, something in that range. So, I mean, we're not talking about an age where there was a lot of wealth, where there was much in the way of technology. And the reason there wasn't, of course, is because it wasn't a capitalist society. Despite the fact of what people like, some of these people like Robert Sirico and Michael Novak and other people say, Roman Catholicism did not produce capitalism. Now, maybe before we go too much further here, maybe we ought to define, or maybe review, I should say, what capitalism actually is, because we did talk about this in an earlier chapter. This was from I believe it was chapter 3 on Rerum Novarum. I'm just going to read to you, this is a paragraph written by John Robbins. It's actually a very good definition of capitalism. So let's find out what capitalism is. Quote, before we continue our discussion of Rerum Novarum and the economic thought of the Roman church state, we ought to define capitalism. Capitalism is sometimes called the free enterprise system, the private property order, or laissez-faire. Is the economic system in which individuals and groups are free to own property of all sorts and to dispose of it as they see fit. It is the economic counterpart to the political system of limited government, in which the only functions of government are the punishment of evildoers, that is, criminals, and the praise of the good. In a purely capitalist system, government does not interfere with private property, free association, freedom of contract, or other freedoms protected in the Bill of Rights. Just as an aside there, you can see how far away we here in the United States have drifted from capitalism just by reading what John said there. And continuing, quote, that is government's only function is the apprehension and punishment of criminals and the protection of life and property from criminal action. In a capitalist system, government does not own or control the means of production, subsidize churches or other institutions, provide or pay for education, retirement benefits, health insurance, recreation, or any of the other innumerable goods and services provided by governments at the end of the 20th century. And also, let's also talk a bit about what capitalism is not, because this is just as important. Capitalism is not a system of greed, writes John Robbins, as its myriad detractors, including the Roman church state, have alleged. The German sociologist Max Weber established that point a century ago, In his seminal book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, Weber argued, the impulse to acquisition, pursuit of gain, of money, of the greatest possible amount of money, has in itself nothing to do with capitalism. This impulse exists and has existed among waiters, physicians, coachmen, artists, prostitutes, dishonest officials, soldiers, nobles, crusaders, gamblers, and beggars. One may say that it has been common to all sorts and conditions of men at all times and in all countries of the earth, wherever the objective possibility of it is or has been given. Unlimited greed for gain is not in the least identical with capitalism, and is still less its spirit. Capitalism may even be identical with restraint, or at least a rational tempering of this irrational impulse. But capitalism is identical with the pursuit of profit, and forever renewed profit, by means of continuous, rational, capitalistic enterprise. And even in the Bible, the Bible does not eschew the idea of profit. Profit is not a dirty word in the scriptures. Think, for example, that Jesus asked a rhetorical question one time. He said, what does it profit a man to gain the world and lose his own soul? And then the Apostle Paul, and this is Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 13, this is famous chapter on love. And Paul wrote this, quote, and though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned, but have not love, it profits me nothing. You notice he says, it profits me nothing. So both Jesus and the Apostle Paul appeal to the profit motive. So profit is not a dirty word. Profit's a good thing. If you do good work, do good quality work, you do it honestly, you treat people well, that profit is your reward as a worker. What the workman's worthy of his wages, I think it says somewhere. So capitalism, again, capitalism is not a system of greed. This is one of the things that you find in a lot of Roman Catholic writers, is they will make that accusation that capitalism is a system of greed. I don't know if Fanfani specifically called it a system of greed or not, but when you read through his book, I haven't read through the whole thing, but even when you just skim through certain parts of it, you get the idea that's kind of is what he believed. Whether or not he used the term greed or not is immaterial. I think that concept is certainly present there in his book. So let's take a look here. Oh, here's an interesting quote. I wanted to share this with you. This is on page 74 of Ecclesiastical Megalomania. And this is a paragraph. This is actually a paragraph taken from Catholicism, Protestantism, and Capitalism by Fanfani. So John Robbins quotes this entire paragraph. I'll read through that, and then he's got a comment, and I'd like to make a comment on this paragraph as well. All right, so here's Fanfani. Quote, the pre-capitalist age is the period in which definite social institutions such as, for instance, the church, the state, the guild, act as guardians of an economic order that is not based on criteria of individual economic utility. The corporation or guild is typical of the period. It is the guardian of a system of economic activity in which the purely economic interests of the individual are sacrificed, either to the moral and religious interests of the individual, the attainment of which is under the control of special public institutions, or to the economic and extra-economic interests of the community. Competition was restricted. The distribution of customers, hence a minimum of work, was assured. A certain type of work was compulsory. Trade with various groups might be forbidden for political or religious reasons. Certain practices were compulsory, and working hours were limited. There are a number of compulsory feasts, prices and rates of increase were fixed. Measures were taken to prevent speculation. End quote. And all right, so this is what John Robbins says about this. He says this, quote, Fanfani reports that during the Middle Ages, when the Roman church state was the dominant institution in Europe, the economic well-being of the individual was sacrificed so that the economic well-being of others might be enhanced. That is, the individual's well-being was sacrificed to the common good. And the common good is one of those buzzwords that you see all the time in Roman Catholic writers. You see it a lot in papal encyclicals and also in other official types of documents on economics that are written by individuals connected with the Roman Catholic Church state. They talk a lot about the common good. And of course, that is really a very collectivist idea. Roman Catholicism, the whole cast of Roman Catholic economics and politics is collectivist. And a lot of these popes, a lot of these various writers on economics, they clearly denounce and despise the idea of individualism. Of course, Christianity is very individualistic. God saves individual sinners. Now, Christianity is individualistic, and the economics of the Bible are also individualistic. But Rome is constantly denouncing individualism. Now, there's something else here, and I think this is interesting. John Robbins didn't bring this out, but I think, of course, this book was written in 1999, so it was written over 20 years ago. But in light of some of the things that are going on right now with COVID and with a lot of the vaccine mandates and vaccine passports and restrictions that are being put on people right now, whereas, if you're not vaccinated, you can't hold a job, or if you're not vaccinated, you can't go to the store, or you can't go to the gym, or you can't do all of these various things. There's something very interesting in what Fanfani said here. I want to go back and just take a look at that again here. This is what Fanfani said. He said, trade with various groups might be forbidden for political or religious reasons. Well, that's exactly what's going on. And I would maintain to you that this idea, this notion that we have to punish people that aren't vaccinated by saying you can't hold a job if you're not vaccinated. It's like right now there's all that stuff going on in Canada. And I think the Canadians should be praised for standing up against the vax mandates. They want to impose a vax mandate on truckers. If they leave, I guess any trucker that goes into Canada from the United States has to be vaccinated, and any trucker that comes to the United States from Canada has to be vaccinated. And they've had this huge convoy. It's hundreds of miles long, traveling all the way from, I guess, Western Canada, maybe British Columbia. I think they're headed to Ottawa. And the route's lined with people all over the place, holding up signs of support and cheering them on and this kind of thing. And I say good. Yeah. May God bless the Canadian truckers. They're absolutely right to protest against this thing. But the whole cast of what's being done right now by governments, not just in Canada, but in the United States and Europe and Australia and New Zealand and some other places, is to restrict liberty if you haven't been vaccinated. Okay, you can't do business. You can't buy or sell. It's almost like these politicians have ripped off Revelation 13, where, no one may buy or sell unless he gets the mark of the beast. Now, I'm not saying that the COVID vaccine is the mark of the beast, but it is of that same spirit. And it's very, very dangerous. And that was, I think it's interesting that Fanfani talks about, these trade guilds, these corporations, could forbid trade with certain groups for political or religious reasons, and maybe he didn't have the vaccinated or the unvaccinated in mind when he wrote that, but it's what he wrote there is certainly consistent with what we see going on today. Now, John Robbins also quotes a couple of other writers here. I'm just going to mention one by the name of Luthi here. And this is something that Luthi says. Now, Luthi is writing in favor of the Reformation. And Luthi is promoting the idea of capitalism. So here's what he has to say. He says, quote, "The Reformation marks a profound spiritual breach between the Middle Ages and the modern world, bringing a ferment into Western history, which has changed its course irreversibly, far beyond the domain of the Protestant churches and communities, to imprint its mark on the whole Western world. That without Calvin, we could not imagine the founding fathers." So we couldn't imagine the founding fathers of the United States of America without Calvin. Luthi is correct. That the modern industrial society, as well as creative science and rule of law, constitutionalism, in brief, the free society, first appeared and have flourished best in those countries which were molded by Calvinism. And of course, Luthi's absolutely correct. So, you had Weber, he wrote that book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. I guess maybe you could subtitle Fanfani's book, The Catholic Ethic and the Spirit of Oppression, or maybe the Spirit of Fascism or something, because Roman Catholic economics and political theory really tend to lead to a fascist system. So you've got two very different systems here. You've got biblical Christianity on the one hand that produces free societies politically, free societies economically, and then you have Roman Catholicism, by the admission of one of the best scholars of Roman Catholic economic thought, Amintore Fanfani, really leads to a situation where you have an unfree society. Fanfani doesn't necessarily, I don't think he necessarily uses the term fascism, but what he describes is very fascistic in terms of the society that is produced by Roman Catholic political and economic thought. And I wanted to close here today with one last thought, and this is actually a quote from John Robbins. This is from early on in the book. I think it's the introduction. I think it's page 25 of his book, Ecclesiastical Megalomania. Yeah, it's from the introduction. This is how John Robbins closes the introduction. Quote, "And if there be any Roman Catholic readers who are inclined to favor freedom and free enterprise, may they understand that their church does not. And therefore they must choose to be either good Catholics or good Christians." Well, that's enough for today. Thanks so much for staying with me. I really appreciate that. I look forward to seeing you again on our next episode as we continue our walk through Ecclesiastical Megalomania.